The house was small and unremarkable, one of many built in the middle of the 20th century and left mostly unchanged since. Its exterior showed the slow wear of decades. Faded paint, uneven steps, a porch that had been repaired more than once. Inside, the rooms were orderly but sparse. Most of the furniture had been there for years, kept not out of sentiment but habit. Objects were arranged to reduce movement and effort. Nothing suggested preparation for departure, even though departure was close. The neighborhood itself was quiet. Streets followed predictable lines. The sounds were familiar and limited. Passing cars, distant voices, the regular mechanical rhythm of daily life continuing beyond the walls of the house. There was no immediate sign of disruption, no emergency vehicles, no raised voices, no visible urgency. At 75 years old, the woman living there had narrowed her world to what was necessary. The house had become both shelter and boundary. Rooms not used daily were rarely entered. Storage spaces were closed off, not intentionally sealed, but simply left alone. One door in particular led downward, into a basement that had not been opened in years. It remained locked, not because of fear or secrecy, but because there had been no reason to open it. At this stage, there was no crisis unfolding. The environment was stable. The conditions were ordinary. The house stood as it always had, holding the accumulated weight of time and routine. What lay ahead had not yet forced itself into motion. For now, everything remained still. The woman had lived most of her adult life in ordinary circumstances, marked by consistency rather than change. She was born in the late 1940s, part of a generation that grew up during a period of expanding stability in the United States. Her childhood was not defined by scarcity, nor by abundance. It followed a familiar pattern: school, family routines, gradual independence. There was no record of exceptional hardship, and no expectation that her later years would be unstable. As a young adult, she worked in clerical and service roles, jobs that required reliability more than advancement. Employment came and went, sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time. None of it resulted in lasting financial security. Savings accumulated slowly and were often used as needed. There was no inheritance of note, no property passed down in her name. What stability she maintained came from routine rather than assets. Her grandmother had purchased the house decades earlier. It had been modest even then, chosen for affordability rather than investment value. When the grandmother died, the property remained in the family, though ownership and responsibility became less clearly defined over time. The woman eventually moved in, first as a caretaker of the aging structure, later as its primary occupant. There were no formal renovations. Repairs were handled only when necessary. As she aged, her social circle grew smaller. Friends moved away or died. Employment ended not with a clear retirement, but with a gradual withdrawal from the workforce. Income shifted to fixed benefits. Expenses were controlled carefully. There was no margin for unexpected costs. The house adapted to her habits. She limited her movement to the rooms she needed. The kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom became her primary spaces. Other areas were maintained but unused. The basement, accessed by a narrow stairwell, had been locked years earlier after a plumbing issue that was never fully resolved. The key was misplaced. The door remained shut. There was no particular reason to open it. Storage had been managed elsewhere. The basement became a sealed part of the house's past, neither forgotten nor relevant. Her motivation during these years was simple: maintain independence. She avoided assistance programs that required relocation or shared housing. Pride was a factor, but so was familiarity. The house represented continuity. It allowed her to live without oversight, to keep control over daily decisions. This narrowing of life was gradual. There was no single moment when options disappeared. Instead, choices became fewer as time passed. Financial flexibility declined. Physical stamina lessened. Legal arrangements remained informal. The house existed in a state of unresolved ownership, and she continued to live there under assumptions rather than contracts. By the time she reached her mid-70s, the arrangement was fragile. It relied on stability remaining unchanged. There was no buffer against interruption. Still, from the inside, nothing appeared urgent. The routines held. The house stood. The locked basement remained unopened, a fixed element in a life shaped increasingly by limitation. The change arrived without spectacle. It came in the form of a legal notice, delivered according to procedure and written in standard language. The document stated that the woman no longer had the right to remain in the house. The reasons were administrative rather than personal. The property's ownership had been clarified after years of informal arrangement. Taxes had gone unpaid. A legal transfer had occurred without her direct involvement. The result was final. There was no dispute over the wording. The notice outlined a timeline. She was given a fixed number of days to vacate the premises. No alternative accommodation was provided. There was no accompanying social worker or relocation plan. The document assumed compliance. For the first time in years, the routines that had sustained her daily life were no longer sufficient. The house, once a boundary that protected her independence, had become temporary. She began to assess what could be taken and what would be left behind. The scale of the task was limited by her physical capacity and financial means. Storage was not an option. Moving assistance was unaffordable. She contacted distant relatives, but none were in a position to intervene. Some were unaware she still lived in the house. Others had no legal standing. Public housing waitlists were long. Emergency shelters were available, but only temporarily and often shared. Each option carried conditions she had avoided for years. As the deadline approached, the house changed character. Rooms were no longer just spaces of routine but inventories of loss. Objects acquired over decades were reconsidered for their utility rather than their history. Most would remain behind. It was during this assessment that she confronted the limits of what she had access to. Storage areas outside the basement were nearly empty. Documents, tools, and keepsakes that might be useful were not immediately available. The realization was practical, not emotional. She needed to know what resources existed within the house before leaving it. The locked basement door became relevant for the first time in years. It represented unknown storage in a situation where nothing else remained. The key had been lost long ago. The door itself had not been tested recently. This moment marked a shift. The eviction was unavoidable. The isolation it created was administrative rather than geographic, but its effect was similar. She was cut off from stability without replacement. What happened next was not driven by curiosity or sentiment, but by necessity. Accessing the basement was not simple. The door was solid wood, installed decades earlier, and the lock was mechanical rather than modern. There was no record of when it had last been opened. The woman did not remember sealing it, only that at some point the key was no longer available and the need to enter the space had disappeared. For years, the basement had existed as an abstract concept rather than a physical location. With the eviction deadline approaching, abstraction was no longer useful. She began by examining the door and its frame. The lock was old but intact. The hinges were rusted but stable. There was no sign of forced entry in the past. The basement had not been disturbed. Lacking tools designed for the task, she worked slowly. The process took time and effort, spread over multiple days. Eventually, the lock gave way. The door opened inward, releasing a stagnant, enclosed air that indicated long-term disuse rather than recent activity. The basement was unfinished. Concrete walls and floor, exposed beams, minimal lighting. What she found there was not a hidden room or concealed structure, but storage accumulated over multiple generations. Boxes were stacked along the walls, some intact, others partially collapsed. Shelving units held jars, containers, and wrapped items whose contents were not immediately clear. Dust covered most surfaces. There was no evidence of water damage or fire. The space had been organized deliberately at some point, though not recently. Items were grouped by type rather than by time period. Household tools occupied one section. Paper records filled several boxes. Furniture components were stacked carefully against a wall. The arrangement suggested intention rather than abandonment. She worked methodically, beginning with what was closest to the entrance. Movement was slow. The basement stairs were narrow, and carrying items required frequent pauses. She focused first on objects that could be identified quickly: tools, sealed containers, labeled boxes. Anything requiring extended examination was left for later. Among the stored materials were documents belonging to her grandmother: deeds, receipts, correspondence. Some were outdated, others still relevant. She did not assume their value. They were reviewed only to determine whether they might influence the immediate situation. Most did not. Further into the basement, she encountered sealed trunks. These were older than the surrounding boxes, made of wood reinforced with metal. They were heavier and more securely fastened. Opening them required effort and patience. Inside were items that had not been handled in decades. The contents were varied but consistent in one respect: they were preserved. Jewelry wrapped in cloth. Small metal objects stored in protective cases. Paper currency bundled and sealed. Some items were clearly personal. Others appeared to have been retained for reasons not immediately obvious. There was no sudden realization or dramatic shift. The woman did not immediately understand the scope of what she was seeing. She cataloged items as she went, separating what was damaged from what was intact. The process resembled inventory rather than discovery. Over time, patterns emerged. The jewelry was of a type and quality that suggested long-term retention rather than everyday use. Some pieces were accompanied by purchase records. The currency, though old, was not obsolete. In some cases, it was foreign. In others, it was domestic but issued decades earlier. The basement also contained documents related to property and financial instruments that predated her occupancy of the house. Some were no longer valid. Others required verification. None were immediately usable without external confirmation. Physical endurance became a limiting factor. The work was interrupted by fatigue and joint pain. She adjusted by reducing the duration of each session. The basement was not heated. Conditions varied with the weather. She adapted her schedule accordingly. Mental discipline was necessary. There was little time for speculation. Each item was evaluated only for its potential relevance to the immediate problem. Displacement. Objects without clear utility were set aside. Those that might be useful were placed in a separate area near the stairs. As days passed, the basement transitioned from unknown space to working environment. It became part of her daily routine. She entered it with purpose rather than hesitation. The locked door no longer represented separation but access. By the end of this phase, she had identified items that warranted professional evaluation. Their value was not assumed, only possible. The process had not resolved her situation, but it had altered the available options. For the first time since receiving the eviction notice, she possessed resources that extended beyond what she could physically carry out of the house. The basement had not changed her circumstances through sentiment or the physical strain accumulated quickly. Working in the basement required repeated trips up and down the stairs, lifting objects that were not heavy individually but taxing in repetition. At 75, recovery time mattered. What could once have been managed in a single afternoon now required several days. Pain was not dramatic, but persistent. Fatigue shaped decisions. At the same time, the eviction timeline continued unchanged. The legal process did not pause to account for discovery or effort. Each day spent examining the basement was a day closer to removal. The pressure was procedural rather than emotional, but it was constant. Deadlines did not adjust. Verification became the central obstacle. Items identified as potentially valuable were only possibilities until assessed. Jewelry required appraisal. Documents required interpretation. Currency required authentication. Each step involved external institutions, appointments, and transportation. None were easily accessible. There were also limits imposed by uncertainty. Some documents lacked complete records. Some items were damaged by age. The woman could not assume favorable outcomes. She proceeded conservatively, prioritizing what could be evaluated quickly. Health complications began to interfere. Extended periods of standing caused dizziness. Cold conditions aggravated joint stiffness. She shortened sessions further. Progress slowed. The basement inventory remained incomplete, and there was no certainty that the most useful items had already been found. Emotionally, the experience was subdued. There was no sustained optimism. The pressure did not allow for it. There was also no collapse into despair. The work required attention and structure, and that structure limited reflection. The situation was managed one task at a time. The greatest strain came from coordination rather than effort. Scheduling appraisals required phone calls, explanations, and documentation. Transportation required planning and cost. Some appointments led to inconclusive results. Others confirmed modest value, not enough on their own to resolve the housing crisis. The passage of time became less distinct. Days were measured by tasks completed rather than dates. The house itself began to feel temporary. Items set aside near the stairs formed small piles, then were reduced again as decisions were made. Nothing remained static. At one point, she experienced a minor fall on the basement steps. There was no serious injury, but the incident imposed a new boundary. She adjusted her movement further, limiting how much she carried at once. This reduced efficiency but avoided greater risk. As the eviction date approached, it became clear that the basement alone would not provide a complete solution. What it offered was partial mitigation. Enough to delay, perhaps. Enough to negotiate. Not enough to guarantee stability without external assistance. This realization did not produce panic. Produced recalibration. The basement had extended her endurance, not eliminated its limits. The question shifted from discovery to outcome. What could be concluded before the remaining time expired? As the eviction date drew close, the remaining steps became procedural. Items identified from the basement were brought to professionals who could provide formal assessments. Some proved to be of limited value. Others were confirmed as authentic and saleable. None represented sudden wealth. Taken together, however, they altered the immediate outcome. A small number of jewelry pieces were sold through licensed appraisers. The process was documented and conservative. Prices reflected condition and market demand, not sentiment or rarity. The proceeds were modest but immediate. They covered short-term expenses and extended her ability to remain housed beyond the original deadline. Additional documents helped clarify aspects of the property's history, though they did not reverse the eviction. They did, however, support negotiations that delayed enforcement. This bought time rather than resolution. With these extensions, she secured temporary accommodation outside the shelter system. It was not permanent and required ongoing payment. The basement findings did not remove precarity. They reduced its immediacy. The house was eventually vacated according to revised terms. What remained behind was handled by the property's new legal owners. The basement, once opened, did not remain accessible to her. Its role in her life was brief and situational. There was no public recognition at the time, no media attention. The event passed without record beyond legal and transactional documents. The outcome was neither rescue nor failure. It was adjustment. The locked basement did not change everything. It changed enough. In historical terms, the event was small. It did not alter laws or establish precedent. It did not produce lasting security or public record. What it demonstrated was narrower and more common. The locked basement was not a secret inheritance or a hidden escape. It was deferred history, items preserved without plan, held through habit rather than foresight. Their value emerged only when necessity demanded it. For the woman, survival did not come from endurance alone, nor from discovery alone. It came from the intersection of the two, under constraint. The outcome was partial and temporary, but real. Situations like this rarely end cleanly. They conclude through adjustment, delay, and quiet recalculation. What remains is not a lesson about fortune, but about time. What is stored, what is forgotten, and what becomes usable only when there is no alternative left. The house returned to stillness. The basement returned to being closed. The moment passed without announcement, leaving behind only its practical consequence.